captures. Peer-reviewed journal articles. Sorry, there is any audience open the, can turn off the microphone, please.
Turn off.
Kahadi dikat Kahadi.
Please turn off.
Please, everyone, turn off the microphone, please.
Okay, next.
Okay, I'm sorry for. So, Dr. Sterner is currently Topical Issues Editor for Transfer Policy and a member of the editorial board for case studies in transfer policy. The Journal of Planning, Education and Research and University of Florida Press. She is co-author of Energy, Efficiency and Human Activity, Global Trend and Prospect in Cambridge University Press, and author of over 100 book captures. Peer-reviewed journal articles, edited proceeding, review, and research report. She has twice received the University of Florida Research Foundation professorships 2005 until 2007 and 2017 until 2020. And in 2006, she received the Kermit Sigmund Citizen Participation Award from the Gainesville Urbanized Area Metropolitan Transportation Planning Organization. She was recently named a University of Florida Trump Professor 2019 until 2022. She received an EB in History from Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, an MBA from University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and Master of City Planning and PhD from the University of California. And she was coming to Indonesia before about 10 days and visit Andalas University Padang, Indonesian University Depok, and Tan Sri Abang University, of course. So this is our second time Professor Steiner became our speakers. So please welcome Professor Steiner.
I forgot that I was muted. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. I do this with some humility because I would say that we are what will happen to the city as a result of COVID, I think, is going to be an area of major speculation and will play out in a very long term. What I'm going to talk about today is really largely a little bit about how I see the spread of COVID interacting with the city. And then in the second half, I'll talk a little bit more about what has happened primarily in the transportation sector, because that's an area I know, but also because I think that is illustrative of some what's happening in the transportation sector currently is possibly illustrates some interesting challenges for the long term. And I will, I hope I plan to leave some time for you at the end of the presentation to ask some questions. And I hope you would hold the questions till the end, just so that I can keep in the mind frame, unless you have a minor question. I don't know how you plan to handle the questions, but perhaps, how would you prefer to handle questions? I assume it's easier at the end of the presentation. Professor Namari?
Yeah, so
Yes.
we have your presentations about 1 hour, and then we give time like 30 minutes after professor presentation to have a questions.
Okay, I'm not sure
Thank
I
you.
have a full hour. I'm not sure I have a full hour, but I'll present what I have. So as I think about what's happening with COVID, I am reminded of when I think about what's happening in COVID, there is a narrative out there that says that the spread of COVID occurs in dense urban environments. And while at its core that there is some truth to that, the second part of the narrative is something I don't necessarily agree with. That
Ya
is
udah nanti
that
aja dicek kelola nanti dicek aja kelola.
the second part of that is should people be muted? I'm hearing someone talking. It's a little distracting.
Ya. Yang penting mau ibadah beb, jadi ini kita
Tolong Mas Jurkanain
jangan
dimatikan.
mikirin
Mas Jurkanain dimatikan.
Iya, tapi jangan
Please
gitu juga.
turn off the
Kelola
voice,
aja.
please.
So the simple narrative, the response to the claim that density is the source of the problem is that some people are beginning to make projections that you will start to see large population increases in medium-sized cities. And while that may ultimately be what happens, I'm not convinced that that necessarily is going to be the course of action. And that is that the move to medium cities might be seen as the wrong solution to the right problem, which is the fact that the city, high density may be a part of the challenge of COVID because but in reality, what I would argue is that this claim that people will move to medium-sized cities is really built on an argument that's been going on for centuries, but that really was at the core of when urban planning was created. And that is that there's always been this tension and belief of the dichotomy between cities and countries and the countryside as we do urban planning. On this slide, what I show is an image of a idea by a British author named Ebenezer Howard, who wrote about Garden Cities of Tomorrow in 1898. And he basically, in this book, he laid out an argument for, and this was in response to the City of London, the high congestion and the insanitary work conditions in the City of London. And generally speaking, this dichotomy has basically suggested that the cities or the town really related to the closing of nature, but it was the isolation of crowds. There were lots more things to do socially. There were many more social opportunities, an opportunity to work with other different kind of people, an opportunity to do things at any time of the day or night. But it had also separated work from home. The salaries and wages were higher in the city, but that was counterbalanced by higher rents and prices. And there were insanitary working and living conditions in that there were armies of unemployed. There was fog and drought, there was costly drainage, foul air, murky sky, you couldn't see the sky. And there were, while there were well-lit streets, there were slums and gin palaces, and there were all these fancy buildings that the wealthy lived in. And the country was seen as a place where people would relax, people would not really have to worry about being socially engaged. But on the other hand, you would have the beauty of nature. You would have meadows, forests, fresh air, low cost of living. But at the same time, you would have some problems in that there weren't many jobs. There were long hours of work for low wages. And excuse me. And there really was a mix of things that made living there a little bit more difficult. People went there to be quiet. Out of this came the notion that we ought to have something called town country, which I would argue can be seen as the suburbs, where you would have the beauty of nature, social opportunity, fields and parks, easy access, low rents, high wages, low rates, plenty to do, low prices, opportunities for capital, pure air and water. Now, this is going back about 120 years, but it really is important to recognize that when urban planning, at least in the US context, began, there was a response to what were the ills of the city. That is the crowded cities and slums. These pictures are taken from New York City, the tenements of New York City, where people live very close to each other. And the buildings were not designed, these are factory work conditions that were not the best. And in the United States, what happened is that the slum movement began, the planning movement. I'm sorry, I've got to do one more, I've got a technical problem here. I've got to find a document. I thought I had my notes somewhere, so just a second. I'm gonna. Sorry. Sorry, I thought I had my notes and now my document is blank. So I'm gonna have to. I'll be with you in a moment.
It's okay, Professor. We will wait for you.
It's, I thought I had everything where I needed it on my screen and suddenly it's not where I expected it. Oh, I'll go without it. I'll go back to sharing. I don't know why it's not coming back. Okay, I've got it back and now I'll put the presentation back up. And now you don't see the presentation, I assume I'll reshare that. There's the, okay. can you see my screen?
So, okay.
No?
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, we can see.
You can see the screen?
Yeah, I can see your
Yes.
screen.
Yes,
You
Professor,
can?
we can see your screen.
We can see your
Oh,
screen.
good. Okay, good. I see. I'm so sorry about that. Okay, I think we're set now. So, so where was I? I'm on the, not on the correct slide. So what happened is that, okay. So about 100 years ago, as we were planning, got its origins, at least in the United States, it was largely in response to the crowded and congested areas of our city. And in the United States and many places followed that, we really saw a growth of suburban environments beginning really, actually even before this time, there was a growth in suburbia, but it reached its peak after World War II in much lower density. You can see here lots more space. First residential was suburbanized, then retail, and then eventually employment started going to the suburbs, first with back office functions that didn't have a need for face-to-face contact, and then a wide range of production and other similar office functions that really were needed less expensive office space. And I'm sorry, okay. Needed less expensive office space. But the challenge today with COVID is going to the core, and we thought suburbs were a good idea until we realized that as we moved more and more jobs to suburban locations, it became more and more difficult to serve them, and they became congested in the same way that cities had become congested, largely because the suburbs were also built around the automobile. And what we learn and what we have learned is that density is really not the only source of problems. And I'm going to use two maps here from my own state of Florida. But you can begin to understand it. When I look and try to understand where COVID cases are happening in the state of Florida, this is the map that the Florida Department of Health displays on its website. And as you can see, and what you see here, now I know you don't know Florida, but you probably have heard of some cities. For instance, there's Miami has the darker the color, more COVID cases there are in a county. And so what you see is that this is the most urbanized area of East Florida. You'll also see in the middle grouping is Tampa, Orlando. Many of you know Orlando because of Disney, and Jacksonville, which is the fourth city in the state. But what this map is masking, although this map contributes to this idea that urban areas are really the source of the problem. But I'm going to show you a different diagram, the same state, the same information. And this information is presented based on the number of cases per 100,000 in population. What you will notice here is that Miami still has is a node of COVID activity, but suddenly some of these areas, and I know you don't know Florida, but this in fact is a very rural county in the state. And in this area up in here, this is in fact is also very rural. Now you're thinking to yourself, so what I would say is that while cities, and what I will talk a little bit about, is the recognition, first of all, that we're not within the spread of COVID. I would argue that we have gone through, we talk about waves, and we've gone through different periods of time, I would say, in the United States, but really worldwide, that really relate to the characteristics of what what aspect of the population is increasing the spread of COVID. And the challenge we have is partly also that there's a lot of discussion about whether this is a public health issue or this is, and how that relates to the economy. And so within the United States, and there's many, at least from the European discussions that I hear covered by the British broadcast system, there is this argument about how much economic activity do you have and how does that economic activity relate to the spread of the disease. So the challenge is that we can all agree that hand washing and hygiene and social distancing are an important solution to the problem. But before we go forward, we really need to understand the nature of the problem rather than the rhetoric, and the rhetoric being that this disease is spread by high density urban areas. What we begin to realize when we start looking at it is that the initial phases, as the growth of the virus continues, the initial phases really, I would argue, were partly related to density, but not in the way that simple density of large numbers of people living close to each other, is the idea also that it was spread through international travel. And I'll show you some maps of that in a moment. We all know we all generally agree that it started in Wuhan, China. But the second category of transfer really relates to industrial centers. Places like Wuhan, Detroit, and northern Italy, which are connected through their supply chains. The third source was global tourist centers, the ski slopes of Italy, Switzerland, and France. In the United States, the Colorado Rockies. At the same time, inconsistent with this narrative was that there were some spreads in smaller communities into things like places that had large numbers of, in the United States, we have what's called nursing homes, where a large number of older adults live in a single facility. We have funeral parlors where we would have funerals and suddenly this funeral became a source of spread. And cruise ships, which were floating all over the country and the world. And one way you can think about cruise ships is that they are, in a sense, small cities at sea. And the early lockdowns and social distancing measures, such as working from home, the closing of schools, the sheltering in place, are all helping to flatten the curve, the idea being that we don't want to continue to spread. Indeed, the idea of working from home, closing schools, sheltering in place are really indeed how Wuhan and most China in general, Seoul, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Tokyo initially responded to the outbreak. And so really the issue is not density per se, but it is the kind of density in the city. And there's a man named Richard Florida at the University of Toronto who has argued that there is a real difference between rich, dense places like Manhattan and poor, dense places. For example, in this map, I'm showing New York, where what happened in New York is illustrative because New York can be seen as and related to the spread, related to international travel. And there is some evidence based on understanding the virus itself that the spread of the virus, the coronavirus in New York City is more closely related to the coronavirus in Europe whereas in the Western United States, in the Seattle region, which was also hit very early, is directly related to China. But the other issue in New York is that Manhattan, the highest density place in New York, has been less hard hit than many suburban areas of the city. And thus the density can take a reform if we go back to the rich, dense places, which may have led the spread because they were related to international travel, whereas the poor, dense places are places where it was brought to them, it was brought to them in a number of ways. Thus, the poor, dense places may be related to more so to multifamily, multi-generational families, or in factories, or frontline or service work in close proximity to one another or to the public. So for example, when we look at that, when we look at workers in hospitals, nurses, doctors, emergency room, nursing aides, all of those people are taking care of COVID patients. So of course, they, in the absence of all of the safety like masks and personal protection, and even with them, they end up with spreading the germs through their clothing. Whereas, and in other situations, if you look at transit agencies, you end up with drivers having to drive a bus, and there may be the hidden person on the vehicle who has the disease, does not know they have it, or who is going to work in spite of having the disease because they can't afford not to go to work. So this, for example, previous, the 1918 flu pandemic provides some evidence to support this notion of the spread more so through the multi-generational, multi-family housing, or in factories or frontline service workers. So for example, the industrial suburbs of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh were much harder hit in 1918 than the central cities of those cities. Another current example is the case of Singapore, where Singapore thought that they had addressed COVID. And yet they were being applauded internationally for the job they had done of finding people who had it, tracing it down, tracking and tracing it. And yet in late April, they ended up beginning to see a second wave of illnesses in dormitories among migrant workers that have continued to spread and that they're continuing to try to track down. And similarly, this is why we've begun to see a number of cases. This is why in the United States, for instance, some of the spread into small communities had been at events that bring together large families. And New Orleans being seeded by the Mardi Gras celebration, for which the city is so well known. Similar to these industrial situations of people who have a hard time avoiding them is a recognition that in dense urban slums or in concentrations of homeless populations, the solutions that are being proposed on the front line of COVID, that is to wash your hands, don't touch your face, wear a mask, may not be a solution matching the challenges of daily living, where in urban slums, in concentrations of homeless populations, there is not necessarily clean water or soap. And because of the density of population, clean water and soap are not widely available, and social distancing, because of the way people are living, is almost impossible. So I'm going to shift now to looking at the transportation sector. And this is an interesting diagram. As I mentioned earlier, one of the concerns in the first phase, Wuhan is said to be the center of the beginning of the epidemic. But what you see here is the spread from Wuhan to other cities in Asia on the upper right quadrant, to other cities in China, and to Paris through various direct activities and direct lines, and then from Paris spreading to the United States through various cities, through Beijing to the west coast of the United States and to New York, and from Shanghai into major cities in the US, but also throughout Asia and other parts of the world. You'll also notice Jakarta is on here. So this was one primary spread, but if you've been watching the news and understanding what has been happening with air travel, is that it has literally stopped, except for a small number. The percentage of people, the occupancy and the airlines have cut back almost 80%, depending upon which one airline you're talking about. A second aspect then has also been a cargo. And where this gets interesting, and I think most people didn't anticipate, and I saw a map, but I couldn't find it to replicate it. But what you find when you look at cargo is that you have the areas of the world, and it first started because China closed down, and China is an area of such large manufacturing. But other parts of Asia are also, in the first wave, you had manufacturing shutdowns. So you had materials that would go into the manufacturing process waiting to get into China. When the United States and Europe closed down, you suddenly had the people who were buying those products not buying them. And so suddenly you had ships that had been sent out of China before China shut down. Those ships were headed all over the world. And suddenly what you see in this map is that all along the coasts throughout the world, there are a large number of cargo ships just waiting to either be let into the country to become inputs into manufacturing, or to be let out of the country to go to deliver for the consumer markets. Now, this is not to say that there isn't, what we have learned though, is that the supply, the supply chain logistics have in some respects broken down. In the United States, in the early days, at our grocery stores, we had a shortage of toilet paper. And that may sound like an odd thing to have a supply of toilet paper. Why should you have a shortage of toilet paper? And some people initially said it was that people were hoarding it because in time of fear, they would go to the store and buy lots of toilet paper. But later later explanation of this was that there is, in fact, with more people working from home, on the residential side, there was an increase of 40% in the demand for toilet paper in the home, but there was a decrease in demand for toilet paper in offices. And that the two had totally separate supply chains, and that what we really needed to do was to get the manufacturing to match manufacturing of that product to match the supply, the demands of consumers. And but I would argue that there's many other similar products. When you look at how office and businesses operate, they are operating under what goes to supply businesses, restaurants, everything up and down the chain is often segmented separately, at least in the United States and Europe, from the supply to consumers, largely because of the volume at which those items are purchased. For businesses will buy it in a larger bulk. So, and why am I bringing this up? Because I would argue that I think what's one of the results of COVID may be that businesses, we will not go to back to business as usual, but there may be some implications for where people work that will affect those supply chains and ultimately the cities in which these activities take place. Going back, so I've talked about two different trends at the international level. That is the movement of people by air. While there, and cruise ships could be seen another movement, massive movements between countries. And the movement of freight by cargo. The other point I want to make in cities that I think is ultimately likely to be a major factor in cities is the way in which the cities, which had largely been dominated by automobiles, have begun to see a lot of changes. In the absence of automobile traffic and with the need for greater continued social distancing among pedestrians in cities, cities have begun to allocate the urban space very differently. And what we begin to see, I thought I had a different, I'm here. This slide is in the wrong place. Sorry, this slide is in the wrong place. In some cities, we've seen documentation of animals taking over public spaces that humans used to occupy. At the same time, we've found an opportunity for a greater diversity of transportation choices in cities. So many cities have this push button that you see here is often the means through which a pedestrian gets a walk signal in many cities. But because the act of touching that that device, the pedestrian call signal, may in fact lead to the spread of COVID, what we've begun to have is that some cities have given priority to pedestrians, so they no longer have to push that button. In other ways, in other cities, more of the streets have been open to pedestrians. Many cities have, this is both in the United States, but really worldwide, bike share, which is a strategy to make bicycles, so you don't have to own your own bicycle. They've made those free, again, on the logic that people need to be able to get around the city more easily. Similarly, walking and bicycling has become much more common. Now, this is obviously not during COVID, but obviously the opportunity for greater opportunities for bicycles and pedestrians to take over urban space has been enhanced. And ultimately, what I would argue we have going on is really, at least during this period in which the cities have been shut down and economic activity is much less, is there is a recognition that there is a place and a need for space for pedestrians in cities, and a need for getting around on modes other than simply the automobile in dense urban centers. And yet those kinds of activities need to be done at social distancing. And even before COVID became a reality in many of our cities, there have been battles over a limited amount of urban space and how it's allocated among the users of the system and what's the most efficient and effective means of allocating that space in cities. I'm going to shift now to talking a little bit about transit, because I would argue transit has been affected even more strongly than any other mode. And estimates are that there's been declines of somewhere in the range of 60 to 80% in transit. Now, in many cities throughout the world. Now, one part of that is the need for social distancing. You'll notice here that we have everyone wearing a mask. Everyone is far enough away from everyone else. And at the same time, it is difficult for transit agencies to continue to operate when they're not bringing in any revenues. Consistent with that, we've also recognized that the people who are using transit are doing so because they do not own an automobile and cannot afford any other way to get around for a long distance within a region. Even though many cities in recent years had seen declines in travel by transit because of Uber and Lyft and other kinds of technology-enabled transportation options, there is sort of a very real question of, are you willing to pay more money when you don't know that the driver of that Uber or Lyft is doing anything to ensure that the surfaces in their car are clean and such. And it's more difficult in a car to socially distance because there isn't 6 feet of distance between the driver and the passenger. One thing that transit agencies have started to do is offer fare-free transit. Some cities had started to offer that before that in order to encourage people to use transit. But it's difficult to know what is going to, how this is going to shake out, and how transit agencies have spent more time washing down surfaces and all that. Some, New York, for instance, used to have 24-hour service. They've closed down their transit system so that they can clean out their transit vehicles every night. There was also rumors that people who were did not have homes were staying on the transit systems overnight. So transit will be an area, I think, what's going to be difficult in the future. The other equally important trend has really been the use of telecommunications. And that is that all of us went from work, those of us that could go from work to home have done so. And I would argue that that's the greatest source of what I would say is uncertainty in what happens to the city in the future. We've gone home, but we have substituted telecommunications where possible for travel. And we have done it in many areas of our life. That is, I might come to Indonesia to do this lecture, but I probably wouldn't come for one single lecture, given the dangers associated with international air travel. But I'm able to speak to you this morning by virtue of telecommunications. And the telecommunications opportunities themselves are happening. We in our university and universities all over the world went to online and distance learning so that we did not meet face-to-face and risk the spread of COVID. And yet the question remains of how much of that activity that had previously been seen as largely face-to-face activity will remain in an online environment. I don't have to tell you, because you understand as much as I do, that the experience of an online lecture and online class is not the same as being in the room with everyone else. The second day that I decided to offer my class from my home, my internet stopped working in the middle of the class. Now that would not happen if I were meeting with my students face to face. So that from one side, we've learned and we've figured out that certain things can replace face-to-face contact, but they may not necessarily be a good substitute for face-to-face contact. But the other challenge, I think, in thinking about how we move forward is the recognition that face-to-face interactions are the basis of which cities are built. They're the basis of which much of creativity is built. The notion of people working on different problems they're come together and start talking about something in a random conversation with someone on the street. And those kinds of things in an environment, it's more difficult to have random conversations when you have to schedule them by internet or schedule a meeting. So, and places like universities and innovative companies that have been built on face-to-face contact will, I think, be questioning how they move forward. Many years ago, there's a tech company that was later bought out by, I'm not sure which of the technology giants. It's Yahoo, and there's Yahoo was the innovator in providing emails many years ago. But at a certain point, they got a new CEO who concluded that the company was no longer being innovative and that it needed to bring that they had been too willing to let people work from home, and that the creativity of those people, that creativity created through chance interactions, was being lost without face-to-face contact. And so this is sort of pretty much, I'm coming to the end of my presentation, which is to say that I think some of the lessons of what we've gone through, first of all, is I would say that a lot of the speculation, a lot of the ideas about what will happen to the city can be seen as speculation that may be able to be justified based on a number of assumptions, but humans will interact. There's a lot of actors when we start thinking about who creates the city and what it is. We know that there's going to be this phase during which we know that there's active spread. And before we get to enough immunity among the population to ensure that the disease is not spread when we go out in public. We've gone through closing the restaurants and closing a lot of activities that create the social life of the city. I should mention live performances and things of that sort. And as we slowly go back to them, we have that piece of the social life and what creates that social life, and the ability to interact in the way that we're accustomed to when we have to keep 6 feet from people we don't necessarily know. But there's also the question of what businesses who have largely populated urban centers will do. Will they keep their employees working from home because they've learned that the functions that they served in the office can be served by having those employees work from home, or by having those employees work from home at least a couple days of the week, meaning they can reduce the amount of office space they need to provide for them. That can also be seen as transferring of costs, because it's probably less expensive for a business to operate a office space than it is for each person individually to make their home conducive to working from home. So really, some of this, I think, will depend upon decisions about how we come back to a normal. I think the other part of this spread that we haven't really begun to understand, and if we really go back to the idea of the spread being associated with international travel, at least into larger parts of society, what we haven't seen in the spread is the impact of the poor, the less wealthy countries throughout the world, where they don't have the form of social safety net. They don't have the option to test people like the United States and Europe are doing as one solution to trying to suppress the spread. They also tend to be much more urbanized, and there is always that question of what will happen as they begin to spread through large, densely populated areas in cities throughout the world. and in places where people don't have the option to wash their hands because they may be facing the choice of buying soap or eating for that month. And so I think there's a whole issues of equity and how we're going to address, we as a society, and how we will address the needs of people who have less, who are much more vulnerable and much less capable of addressing their own needs than those of us that live privileged lives, even within our own country or in other countries. So where will the city go back to? I'm not sure. I think the cities will continue to have the same basic features that they have always had, which is they will be the place of face-to-face, a large-scale economic activity. They will be a place where we gather in crowds and in order to be entertained by people at performances, at restaurants, and a number of other things. We will continue to have we are more likely to have employment in those cities, depending upon, of course, the decisions made by the owners of those businesses. But if the businesses see a need for face-to-face attention to each other, then they will continue and will, so to speak, double down by staying into the cities. One other thing it's worth mentioning in preparation for this, I began to read some things saying that there are certain cities that have been less hard hit in the US context, and US and European context, I would say, is probably a better description. And for instance, they cite the fact that the city of San Francisco has not been very hard hit. And one explanation is that those places don't necessarily have children, that there's not a large number of children in households, and that children, because they tend to get a less severe response to it, may be the silent carriers of COVID. I don't believe, well, based on what I've read, it is possible that that is a source of silent spread. But until, and the challenge is that until we know by testing, and as I've described a few minutes ago, testing will not be equally available throughout the Western industrialized countries, but also throughout the world. That spread and how we control it in the long term and prevent it from coming back in waves through that international travel is going to be a major challenge. And so I leave with the notion, leave this presentation by saying there is a function of cities. Cities have been the place of highest interaction. And I believe that there may be some reorganization of activities in cities. Some employers may decide they don't need to be in the largest cities, but others will choose to continue to stay there. And they will bring people into working in those cities. Although I would argue that what we have learned about the ability to use technology to enhance communications may have serious implications for both the social and cultural life of in our cities. That's all I have, and I'm prepared to take some questions at this point.
Okay, thank you so much for Professor Steiner for the presentation. So before we open for question and answer, we would love to ask Professor for taking picture online together with all of us.
Okay.
So please,
I'm
for
trying
all
to
the audience, to open the cameras, please.
Okay. I want to see that picture. I like that background, San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge.
Oh yeah, you sounds like on vacations, Professor.
Oh no, I'm doing that because Florida has beaches.
Masari, ayo, foto.
Maybe,
Yeah.
sorry, maybe you must turn off your share screen sharing.
Oh, okay.
Okay, do you have what you need to take the picture?
We need you to turn off the
Screen.
My screen.
yeah, the presentation screen,
Okay,
please.
I'll stop sharing. Okay,
Okay.
there we go. Oh,
Thank
okay.
you.
Good.
Okay.
Oke, Mas Ari, silakan diambil capture-nya.
It's look like not everyone opened the camera.
Lots of people did not. I think one page at least.
Okay. I'm gonna
Ini nggak bisa
take a
on kamera, host tolong. You cannot start the video because the host has stopped.
Bang, kamera setting bang.
Kamera setting.
This doesn't quite look the same as having all of you surrounding me like the last time I did a lecture for you. If you'll excuse me, I just spilled some water. I'll be right back.
Okay, the setting has been applied. You all now can open the camera.
Masih belum bisa.
Terus sebentar ya, itu apa? Profesornya lagi ngambil layar minum dulu.
Masih belum bisa.
Well, we already have 3 questions on the chat. So anyone?
Yes, I saw those. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that.
It's okay, Professor.
Okay,
Okay,
so the first one, I'm not sure what it looks like. It's in maybe the one on YouTube. The webinar is live on okay.
Okay, can we take the picture now? Okay,
Yes, okay, I see the first one. I want to ask, as we know, our government has plans to move the capital city from Java, Jakarta, to another island, the city of, in Kalimantan Island. What do you think about the impact COVID to this plan and how our government minimized the impact of city development? Okay, so I remember hearing about that, and what I can say about moving capitals is that there is a rich history within urban planning of countries moving their capital to a less populated area, or sometimes in response to a president who's from a certain region deciding they need more economic activity associated with the capital. The evidence on it is somewhat mixed in its ability to do that. And the country I'm most familiar with, because I've traveled to both of them, is in Brazil. Well, I'll start by saying it is not unprecedented to move the national capital. For other reasons, the United States, in our early years, our nation's capital was actually in the city of Philadelphia for a time, before it was moved to Washington, D.C., which was carved out as a separate district. The move out of Jakarta seems to be motivated by what somewhat motivated the move in Brazil from Rio de Janeiro to Brasilia. And that happened in the early 1960s, so there's about 60 years of experience in the move in national capital. And what many people say is that some functions of a national government are still taking place in Rio de Janeiro, even many years later. And I think I can understand the motivation, which is, and Seoul, South Korea attempted to move some of their functions out of the city center. It is not unlike which is that in a congested city, if it's difficult to get to the government, it is difficult to think about how you do business. Now, I would argue, I think the situation in Indonesia has multiple dimensions that I think are quite interesting. Because you're an island nation, you also have this question of movement between the national capital and other parts of the country, which is only, it will take either ships or airplanes to do that. Whereas when you're looking at a place like like the move in Brazil, even though it was a greater distance, there is still some opportunities to get there through other modes of transportation. So I don't understand all the reasons for the move of the national capital. I think the challenge of COVID, we had solutions, and actually the Brasilia is an interesting capital because it was built around the automobile rather than around face-to-face contact. And what is interesting, I observed as when I went to Brasilia, was that it was difficult to walk there. The roads were designed for continuous movement of automobiles, and the pedestrian environment was extremely difficult. And in many respects, it was going against the grain of what has been happening in other cities, which is recognizing that as cities get to be larger and larger, we still are going to need some level of density. And the best way to accommodate it from a transportation perspective is public transit. Now, I will grant you that public transit is difficult during COVID. But I would also argue that once we get out of COVID, when we're no longer thinking about a pandemic environment, we public transit will still have the characteristics that make it much easier to connect. And I know that Jakarta has only begun to develop their public transit system. I think once we're no longer worried about the person next to us to be potential point of contagion for COVID, I think we will begin to, it's going to take a long time to begin to trust using public transit. But from a transportation perspective, it is one of the most efficient ways to move a large number of people around the city. And so that is kind of that is really a major dilemma. So when is the government, when is the move to Kalimantan expected to take place?
I don't know. Maybe I just I read from the newspaper or online news. Mr. Jokowi already make a decision to move.
Right.
Yeah, I know. Mr. Jokowi already make a decision to move our government. As you know, there is many things when we build a new capital, about transportation, about building, everything. As you know, impact of the COVID, everyone in my place, there is we must take a social distance to communicate.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct.
This is I think so difficult to our government if this is pandemic is not going to finish the virus. I think it's problem. What do you think our government do if the virus is still in our country for a long time? I don't know the virus.
Yeah, and it could be. I think, well, in public health, the concept they talk about is herd immunity, which is when enough of the population gets COVID, assuming that they maintain immunity long term.
Yeah.
If enough people get it, then it no longer, the risk of it spreading to other populations decreases with the higher the percentage of the population that has it. And in fact, there are some there's no definitive information, but I have read and heard stories about some people believe that, they're trying to explain why Europe and the United States, Europe and parts of Europe, especially the UK and the United States, have been harder hit by COVID than many other places.
Yeah.
And I sort of tipped my hand a bit in my presentation when I said, I think I've come to believe that one part of it is that it's spread among international travelers and the wealthy rather than poor populations. But another explanation I have heard that some people are claiming, and I'm not knowledgeable enough in that area to know, but I at least have heard, which is that there are some people believe that just like the influenza, which we get on an annual basis, over time, while it's not the same virus every year, once we've had, it's sort of an accumulation of different kind of viruses. And there are some people who believe that places that were hard hit by SARS and other coronaviruses may in fact have a certain level of immunity to coronaviruses in general. I'm not a scientist in that area, but I think it's worth asking questions about that. And that the assumption then is that over time we develop a certain level of immunity within the community, and then we no longer need to worry as much about social distancing because we don't have to worry about the disease spreading silently among the population. And we're a ways away from that, but that's that is the logic. I don't know if you've been following, but Sweden has in fact not closed their restaurants. They've done a few things like wearing masks, but they've not closed down their country in the way that many other places have.
Yes.
And that it remains controversial because the number of deaths they've had, especially among vulnerable populations, that being immigrants to the country and older people, their rates of death have been much higher among certain populations than others. And so, and their number, for instance, the number of cases they've had is comparable. The country of Portugal is about the same in population as Sweden. And they both have had a similar number of cases, but Sweden has had, I believe, 10 times the deaths that they've had in Portugal, because Sweden has not closed the economy down as much and has not done as much to slow the spread of it. How that will evolve over time is unknown, and that's where one thing I would say as a researcher that I think about with respect to what's happening worldwide is we have a lot of what you would call natural experiments. Different countries are taking different approaches, and with time we can begin to assess the efficiency and effectiveness of those approaches. And in the United States, we have 50 states, all of whom are taking different approaches. So even within the same country context, we have certain things that are being done similarly. So there's a second question that I don't know, but this is about the supply, the break in supply chain. I think one of the ways I think about that question is that supply chains are something that companies change over time in response to the business demand that they face. But one way to think about COVID is that it is disruptive by definition. And it changed a set of social and economic relationships that were existing that really had to evolve over time. So what you have is that in the initial phase, they couldn't for certain products. Disinfectants is another example. I could have used that as an example. Except I would, toilet paper is a more essential product than disinfectant in the sense it has greater demand and more predictable purchases. But disinfectants, the same thing happened there, which is businesses, you have all these cleaning supplies, but if you have empty office buildings, you no longer have a need for cleaning supplies. What I would argue, I think is going to happen, we're continuing to have a disruption because we still, well, what I would say is that commerce shifted from purchases in stores to purchases online. And I would say it could, I neglected to mention it in my presentation, and I should have talked about that, because I would also argue that cities have always been a place of, most cities have been a place of consumption. That is, we have all the high-end stores. If you go to New York City, you go to San Francisco, there's people will fly to those cities to go shopping. And so, or you have the Mall of America in Minneapolis, where people will fly in for the day, go on a shopping spree, and then go home. And what we have seen and will see, and it relates to supply chains, because what I would say is over time, I think they've continued to be a place of consumption, but in a slightly different way, and probably in a concentrated way, in that they went from, you went from having a large number of stores in every city in what was the regional shopping mall. And that regional shopping mall is slowly dying because people can order online. Now, what you have seen by retailers is that they have gradually changed their supply chains from having all these items in their store, so their store is a warehouse, you could argue, to where you can order online and get in-store delivery just in time. So obviously COVID has changed our supply chains in large numbers of ways. An adjustment I saw locally here is that restaurants were suddenly closed, but they went to carry out food. Yeah. So I could either drive to the store and pick it up. I wouldn't have to go inside. I would have somebody come to my car and say, would you like to, what did you order for dinner? And they will bring it. In the US, there used to be in the 1950s what they call car hops, where they'd come to your car, take your order and bring it out to you. Oh. And in a way, we've gone back to an old method of delivery. Or in the alternative, you can order online and you can have somebody deliver it to your house, or you can go and pick it up. So there's multiple options to prevent you from having to go to those spaces. Similarly, grocery stores have started delivery services where they didn't, and grocery stores in many parts of the world have had a difficult time making home delivery work for them. And I think one side of it was people at their home saying, why would I want to have somebody pick up my groceries for me when I like to have choice about which vegetables I buy or whatever. But you may see, it is possible that certain aspects of delivery services that consumers had not accepted in the past, they may be more willing to do in the future. Now some of that I would argue, what I would argue has happened is that COVID created a serious disruption in supply chain that I think we will gradually go back, because as more businesses open, the supply chain that served businesses, a large number of businesses and major office buildings and all that, as those begin to open up, you're going to again have deliveries back to them, and that the consumer versus the large scale consumer, like the individual consumer versus the large scale consumer. Those supply chains will again have to shift back in, and they can probably be done gradually. We may have some mismatches just because it's in a changing environment. It's often hard to predict supply and demand necessity for that. So I would argue that, and in many aspects, I think the social distancing will continue, but it will gradually ease. And that is where places that are points of high contact, sit down restaurants that have close sitting, bars, public transit, public performances, theater, dance, all of those kind of performances are probably going to take longer to come back than those that can be, than activities that can be accomplished through other means of social distancing.
Okay, thank you for explanation.
Does that make sense? Do you have
Yeah.
any follow-up
Yeah.
questions?
No,
Do you have any?
I just think what everyone think we're so afraid about the impact of the COVID.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think the challenge is that a lot of these, the way I think about it is we've had a major disruption, and I think everybody talks about the new normal, and I think there will be a new normal, but, and I think some of the barriers to change that have persisted in the past, and I'll use two examples. One is the use of technologies for meetings. The second being delivery of all sorts of goods to our homes. There may have been consumer resistance largely because of the price we were being asked to pay. I think now we know what we now have is, if you think about the life cycle of an innovation, is that you keep scaling up, and there is always this question of how large is the market for something. And so you might see, for instance, in congested cities where in the past it was an ordeal to go grocery shopping, the idea of outsourcing it, if you are wealthy enough to do that, may be much more appealing now that you know that it can work. And we've put systems in place to handle we agree it might work now, though. I mean, the other part of that system, if you think about it, is with everybody at their home, making a delivery to a home is not a problem. Now, what happens once everybody's starting to be out of their home more frequently? Making a delivery to the home cannot always assume that someone's going to be home. So I think there's going to be these sort of things that work under COVID that may not work once we go back to a more a different kind of normal life. So I just think, and I think the way I think about it in cities is that one thing is that a lot of things in the cities are what you might call cumulative impacts. It's not just one person deciding to drive to the city. It's hundreds and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people individually deciding to do that. And they decide to do it when right now it's pretty easy to travel by your car in many cities.
Yeah.
But looking forward, that's where it's going to be a challenge. And if you face sitting in traffic for 4 hours to drive somewhere, or you can find transit that has greater problems with social distancing that costs you much less time and money. At certain points, there's going to be individual decisions that will collectively mean we eventually go back to transit. How quickly and at what social cost is a different question. So infrastructure projects is the second question. Is there any other questions on that? I thought those were good questions. There's a question, most infrastructure projects in Indonesia were discontinued because of the budget being diverted for COVID handling. This leads to many construction perpetrators experiencing losses and delayed employment and tender cancellations. my question is, what is applied to government contractor in construction to get a condition? So what's happened in the United States, and this sort of, I think, is a question that relates to the wealth of a country, because certainly Indonesia, the transferring of money to handling COVID. In the United States, the response in many places has actually been to accelerate transportation projects. Not uniformly, but where the budget had been allocated, there had been some movement of money. Now, whether that will continue long-term is actually a question I think that our political system will have to deal with. But there was a recognition that it is so much easier to do construction projects when there isn't a lot of traffic. But whether the reduction in funding for government will mean that our other construction projects are delayed, we may be more in a more similar situation to what you're describing in Indonesia, although it's not directly it is COVID related in the sense that we may be borrowing, we may be accelerating projects today, but we will have less money for government operations generally, and which means that we did get some construction projects. It all depends upon how it plays out politically, I would argue, because the other question we're going to have in the United States, and the response to the 2008 recession actually was to increase the number of transportation projects, because they became a form of government inducement to increase employment. So a great question. I fear I can't be definitive.
Can I ask, Miss?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, my name is Ari Martua, and I'm a student of Tarniabing University, and my major is information system.
Yes.
So after following this webinar, I thought that it's very useful. For information, I'm listening to New York Times podcast, so I know the culture of American, and it's like in Indonesia. If I want to compare about the developing city in America and in Indonesia after COVID-19, it's very different. If we look, America is a superpower country, but Indonesia is a growth country, and we are using the infrastructure for our foundation to be a super country.
Mhm.
And indeed, yes, you previously said we need to rise up and go up in this COVID-19 issue. As you know, I know in America and other country, in Indonesia too, many people suffering because this lockdown issue. Everyone lost their job. If you want to increase our city development impact after COVID-19 pandemic, of course the human resource must be good too. But how the human resource can be good if all of the citizens lost their opportunity to job, lost their salary? Now in Indonesia, following Governor Jakarta, there's an issue here. So there's the lockdown period time is increased from time to time. It's been like 3 months now. We're in lockdown. Me as student, we have worked from home or learned from home for 3 months from right now on. How do you think that we're not like American? We have a good, solid economy fundamental like America, but how if we as a citizen can further up, be as like the American to continue in this crisis condition? Because scientists do not can even found the vaccine soon to the COVID-19, so we don't know how to remediate in this issue. World Health Organization says as the world citizen needs to stay alive with the virus, so we can work from home or work from my life in this condition. But is that okay if we go out and work like before in this issue of COVID-19 after World Health Organization size that it's okay, because if not, we're losing our job, we're losing our funds, and we cannot fund our feed our family. That's it for you, Miss. Thank you.
We're struggling with that same question in the United States, believe it or not. As for being a superpower, there are some places I've listened to out of Europe saying that perhaps a big challenge in this is that the United States, our president has not been willing to take the lead, has not shown a strong leadership role, and has in fact criticized the World Health Organization and others who've attempted to take a leadership role. But the United States has the same question of how we will bring back our economy.
Yep.
And I think it's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah, of course.
Worldwide, which is where now we have recent experience because our economy collapsed in 2008. I'm going to profess that I don't have a lot of knowledge, deep knowledge of what the impact of the crash of the markets in the crisis of 2008 has done to other parts of the world, in particular Indonesia. But I would say from what the discussion in the United States is that we have had ongoing economic growth ever since that crash, the collapse of the economy in 2008. Except that, and so I think there's a number of issues that have come up, and there will be a number of political decisions that need to be made. What I think and I hinted at this in the presentation, I think the issue of inequality is going to become an even more important issue. And employment is a key part of that. But I think the other aspect of this, when we begin to look at, for instance, public transit, what we begin to realize is the people who are using public transit were people who are lower paid workers in major cities, the people who are the people who are on the front lines in COVID in the United States, the most vulnerable. Many of them are paid very low salaries.
Same here to Miss.
Okay, and I will start by saying my area of expertise is not employment, and it's more about thinking about how we plan for cities. But certainly our efforts but we certainly need to begin to address the inequality question. And one thing I would say from my thinking about this is that the importance of a functioning public transit system in major urban areas where a large portions of the population don't own automobiles becomes a much more important factor. And one of the strategies, so it's not employment per se that's going to happen, and I'll speculate a little bit on employment. There may be lessons from 2008 on that respect. But I would say the recognition that there are many governmental services that keep cities going, that keep cities and people going throughout the country will become much more important and hopefully recognized and hopefully rewarded. Public transit being an example, but the communication function of government, the needs for government to coordinate. I would argue in the United States, the move to changing everything for local governments is really been a real challenge. So I'm hoping that people will come out of this recognizing that there is a role for government, and being, I would argue in the United States, at least, we've been in a long period going back probably 40 years of saying government is the problem, not the solution to problems. And I'm hoping that that recognition may mean that we're more willing to fund essential services As for the employment, I think one of the lessons I've read about, I'm going to be clear, I don't spend most of my time thinking about employment. I think about access to employment by virtue of how people get around within cities. But is that there were many more entrepreneurs, that there were people who had a lot of skills and a lot of talents that when they lost their job, they decided to strike out. And I would, from my understanding, and I've read plenty of articles that suggest that there was definitely a period of entrepreneurship, that when people lose their job and they have talents and skills, that they may take ideas because they're desperate to earn a wage. Now, I do have the last question, which I think I'll leave. We've got about 2 minutes. I'm probably not going to be able to answer this, but Anita is asking, the COVID pandemic has decreased industry and construction as backbone for country's economy, and it's resulted in a disruption of supply chain, so that core business is hampered, which affects cash flow. So I think and the company's operational performance has macro impacts, which will affect the country's GDP. That's happening in the United States. They're estimating about almost a 40% drop in GDP for the last quarter, which is quite significant. I fear I don't necessarily have a good response to this question, because what has been happening in the United States is that our central bank, our Federal Reserve Bank, has been doing what they can to ensure that there is financing available for companies to keep logistical issues flowing. That is in an area of what I would call macroeconomics. And although I've taken courses in macroeconomics, that was many years ago, but I would argue that that's really some of the actions taken by central banks by the World Bank and other lenders to companies in Indonesia. That may be the answer to problems. I happen to have a brother who works for the Federal Reserve, and I know that one of the things he has been working on has in fact been doing what he can to help banks ensure that companies have the liquidity to continue operating their businesses. But I don't have intimate knowledge of what's being done in Indonesia, and I will say that it's not an area of expertise of mine. So, except to say that I think, like many other things, most businesses are going to have to adjust, just as I used examples of restaurants going from sit down to either delivery or pickup. I think you're going to see some similar kinds of adjustments, and how that plays out in any given industry is going to be a challenge. As for a country that's built on basic materials, that again is strongly related to what is likely to be a worldwide recession. There are some arguments and there's some commentary about countries that come out of this more quickly may be able to benefit from being able to assist in creating that supply chain. But I think that again remains to be seen. So I thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions. If anybody wants to send me an email, I'm happy to engage you. I hope this was an interesting opportunity for me to think about these questions. I fear I have more questions than answers, but I hope I prompted you to think a bit more about what you might do in your own country. So I wish you a good night, I guess. Good night for you.
Yeah, we're very thank you for Professor Steiner to be our speakers this evening. So we wish that we get all information and we get more knowledge about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the city development this evening. So we hope we can meet again in another time, Professor Steiner.
So do I. Yes, I do plan to come to Indonesia this summer, but it looks like it's not going to happen. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a good day, Professor
Goodbye.
Steiner. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you.
I like that.
Yeah.